Taking seriously findings in moral psychology means not relying on not justified inferentially premises where arguments are supposed to allow us to derive knowledge through their conclusions. That means, I think, not that we have to abandon ethics, but that we have to take a different approach, one that recognises the true depth of our ignorance and involves making bets. We need, I think, to operate in the way that a successful gambler does. Let me explain. The loose reconstruction of Greene's argument, although I think subject to some interesting challenges and has faced some objections, seems to stand up. I think it's very hard to show that this argument is wrong, and so that we really do have to stop relying on not justified inferentially premises. And to be clear, even if this argument doesn't quite work as it stands, I think it does enough to show that you'd have to have some very strong positive reason to rely on those not justified inferentially premises. And the truth is that nobody has ever provided such a reason other than that, there's nothing else to go on. So given that this is our situation, what should we do? How are we going to do ethics without these not justified inferentially premises? Practically all of ethics, all of the contemporary work in ethics seems to rely on them. Now, Singe and Greene agree in thinking that the answer is some form of consequentialism. I don't think that we should take that proposal seriously for two reasons. One is that consequentialism is an incredibly broad theory which has all kinds of implications. It's unlikely, given that the fundamental problem, or at least one of the fundamental problems that ethics has to solve, is how to live together cooperatively. It's unlikely that a theory which encourages us to think about things along a single dimension is going to give us the right answers there. It's just too bold a bet. Perhaps even more importantly, if you go around cutting up healthy people and distributing their organs, you may be saving lives, but you're also facing a long time in prison. You've got to be pretty confident about your philosophical arguments to think that you're right and the law is wrong. The truth is that your philosophical arguments are just not that convincing. They never are. To be honest, that's what put me off ethics years ago. So when I was a first year undergraduate, I thought, oh, ethics, that's interesting. And I read Jonathan Glover's book, Saving Lives, and I just thought, there's no way that this is going to work because the philosophers are so unconvincing in their arguments that we would never have justification to act on their conclusions. And I think that challenge still remains for us here. As an alternative, you might think, well, look, let's think about some reflective equilibrium. Let's go back to rules. The problem there, of course, is that reflective equilibrium leads to a kind of subjectivism. The starting point are the not justified inferentially premises. So what we're really saying is, well, what do I find? What do I find compelling, or what do you find compelling as a starting point? What seems right to me? Now that might work reasonably well as long as you're in a community of people and working together only with people who share your sense of right and wrong. Right? If the fast processes are all delivering the same results across everybody that you have to interact with, that could be fine. It's a little bit kind of mad to think that you're getting at truths, but practically speaking it could work very well. The problem is that, as we've seen, you and I live in societies that combine multiple cultures, and those cultural differences operate across ethical differences as well. There are differences in particular about how much purity matters and what kinds of purities matter. Since we face challenges that we can only solve by acting together as a society, an approach to ethics based on reflective equilibrium fails in its most basic requirement. Our ethical abilities need to facilitate cooperative living, and in particular nowadays to allow us to address challenges like climate change, global poverty, discrimination against homosexuality, and the rest. Discrimination against homosexuals. All of these issues are things that our ethical abilities need to allow us to do. Reflective equilibrium, because it relies on this kind of subjective sense, what do you find likely to be true to start with, will not help us with that. Now you might think, well look, perhaps the difficulty that we've arrived at here is going to force us to take a trip to metaethics. I've resisted this for a long time because I don't think that we're going to find much in the way of justification for one or another metaethical views. You may disagree with that statement. Of course you may. But we might think, well, I've been putting a lot of weight on a comparison between moral cognition and physical cognition or numerical cognition. And that would suggest that we're just thinking about whether or not we can know ethical truths. But maybe we should also think about an analogy with linguistics. We don't need to rely on just one analogy. We can make a variety of analogies. The thing about languages is that they enable us to communicate with each other to some degree. We have these linguistic abilities. But what we know, the story of the last few thousand years or so, is a story of new environmental and technological challenges being met by cultural engineering, being met by the development of practices like writing and the elaboration of standards and the rest, which have allowed forms of communication that would have been unthinkable thousands of years ago. So maybe we should think about ethics on the same model. Maybe what we really need here is not some way of discovering ethical truths, but rather a kind of process of cultural innovation, which will allow us to develop ethical principles that are suitable for achieving cooperation and human flourishing in the modern societies that you and I live in. The thing about this, though, is that meanwhile, you and I are facing practical problems. The problem we face is that, we have to choose a career, we have to choose something about where to live, we have to choose something about giving. These are major decisions that shape our whole lives. For many people as well, the experience of buying a coffee, doing the grocery shopping, or even disposing of waste is an ethical one. This has ethical aspects to it. So it's no good for us to say, well, ethics has to be done via a process of cultural evolution, because the prospects for that at the moment in the UK, in North America, in Hungary, Poland, Brazil, they do not seem particularly propitious. They do not seem like the kind of times when we're likely to be led in a positive way as far as ethics goes, or much else besides. So I think we need some practical guidance here. We need some practical guidance here. How are we going to do this? How are we going to be able to deal with these complex situations that everyday life provides us if there are no ethical theories that we can rely on? And we also know that the fast processes that we do rely on have themselves limits. I want to suggest that we're in the situation that a gambler typically faces. There is very limited knowledge about ethical truths, but we do have some sense of potential risks and potential benefits. Now, gambling, of course, can be done well or badly, but if you think about successful professional gamblers, they're in the business of trying to identify situations that offer them a favourable balance of risk and reward, and learning how to exploit those situations. We, of course, can do the same thing ethically. A good example of this, I think, is one of the questions that Poggy asks. Poggy says, do the global poor have a much stronger moral claim to that 1% of the global product they need to meet their basic needs than we affluent have to take 81 rather than 80% for ourselves? Notice it's not about, there was a lot of stuff recently about the 1%. It's not about the 1%. It's about you and me, people who have the opportunity, even if you're not currently very wealthy, you have the opportunity to be educated to a high level that allows you enormous earning potentials in the future and positions of influence. So do you have a stronger moral claim to the 81% than the global poor have to an additional 1% of global product? Now, I think what you can see here is that whether or not we think we can answer this question with knowledge, there's quite a reasonable bet that we could make here. The risk-reward ratio favours one answer over the other. A fairly small cost could bring out a large ethical benefit. If it turns out that we got the ethics wrong, we will not be doing something very terrible. If it turns out we got the ethics right, then we will be changing from a world in which over 1 billion people live in life-threatening poverty, lacking education housing, healthcare, to a world which is much better in that respect. So it seems to me that there is a good case to be made here for saying, look, I do not know what the answer to this question is for sure, but I can make a reasonable bet. Now, something else that Pogge's approach shows us, I think it shows that there's a role for philosophy here as well. Because what Pogge does is very interesting. Pogge says, look, take an ethical view that you might think is completely ill-disposed towards redistribution of wealth. So take libertarianism. Typically, libertarians emphasize property rights over everything else. And Pogge says, if we take a libertarian perspective, we can still argue that the answer to this question is yes, right? The global poor, even from a libertarian point of view, says Pogge, have a much stronger claim to the extra 1% of global product that they need to make their basic needs than we the affluent do to the 81% rather than just 80%. Now that's interesting to us as philosophers because what it suggests is this. If we have multiple routes to the same answer, and if those answers start from opposing, even contradictory points of view, but all end up at the same route, then we can be more confident in that answer. So philosophy is very helpful to us as ethical gamblers insofar as we can see that the even quite radical differences in starting point may not matter in some cases. In those cases, the risk goes down and therefore the risk-reward ratio is even more favourable to us. So the position we have reached, I suggest, is this. As philosophers, our job is not knowing things. That's what we do for a living. The truth is that we do not know much about ethics, nor are the methods that many philosophers have used suitable for gaining knowledge of ethical principles or answers to questions like Pogge's. But we don't need knowledge. We can make reasonable bets. We can be successful gamblers in many cases where we're making ethical decisions, and philosophy can be enormously helpful for us in doing that because it can show us which answers different perspectives give and where even radically different starting points might converge on a single answer.